What is comprehensible input, or CI? You've heard me talk about it, you know it's important, but what is it precisely and how can we use it to learn foreign languages? Well, I'm going to tell you about that in this video. I'm Luke and this is polýMATHY. Let's start with what incomprehensible input is. If you don't know Italian well, then the story I'm about to tell you in Italian you probably won't understand. Here it goes. Una volta, quando imparavo l'arte del pilotaggio, mi sono perso. Pilotavo, però il sole tramontava e non trovavo più la pista. Questo era un grosso problema, puoi capire? Perché senza trovare la pista, come atterrare, come sopravvivere. Allora ho chiamato l'aeroporto e alla fine mi hanno salvato dicendo dov'ero. So if you don't know Italian fluently, maybe if you know a Romance language, you can understand some of that, maybe even all of it if you've studied a little bit of Italian. But for native English speakers, you probably didn't get very much from that. It was a true story, though. Now, let me give you comprehensible input in Italian that virtually all of you should understand. Questo è un bicchiere. Nel bicchiere c'è acqua. C'è acqua. Ora bevo l'acqua. È acqua. Allora, in questa tazza c'è il caffè. Si vede? Sì, ecco, caffè. Adesso bevo il caffè. Questo invece è un libro. Questo è un libro. Ha le pagine e in questo libro... Wow, ma questo è un libro italiano? No, non è un libro italiano. È un libro giapponese? No, non è un libro giapponese, è un libro greco, un libro greco. That's comprehensible input. Depending on your level of Italian or how familiar you are with other foreign languages, probably most or all of that was comprehensible. Now, there are well-reasoned critiques of the comprehensible input hypothesis. One of them might be, Luke, you basically were talking in baby talk that was really easy to understand and you spoke really slowly. How do I go from something just so utterly simple to something properly advanced, having a conversation with a native Italian speaker, speaking fluently, understanding at a fluent pace, understanding that little story you told earlier about, I don't know what that was about yet. I'll show you how later. Now that is a really good critique. The idea is that you don't necessarily have to do that for very long. As the student progresses, as the class progresses, they get more and more of this comprehensible input, and especially if there's repetition of the same terms, il bicchiere, acqua, caffè, la tazza, ecco, questa è una tazza, right? Tazza, questa è una tazza, ma questo è un bicchiere. So you're learning two different words for drinking vessels like that. So you get that kind of repetition again and again, and you start to expand little by little, and it starts to fill out. Now, the road is long to learn a language. It doesn't mean you can necessarily learn everything right away. But if one takes this notion very strictly, and one tries to plan for oneself an entirely strict curriculum where you understand everything plus just one new thing, well, that can take a very, very long time to acquire sufficient vocabulary, especially with the need for repetition. And I understand that point too. And also, you might get a little bit bored of these basic things. You want to get right to the classic literature. You want to get right to the fluent conversation, or at least understanding the fluent conversation. So how can you do that? How could you learn to understand the little story I told you earlier? Well, here is something that will really turbocharge your learning of whatever foreign language, especially a modern language, and that's with this video sponsor, LingoPi. And I'm going to show you how LingoPi takes programming for native speakers and makes it completely comprehensible and an excellent learning tool for you. And we're going to do that with my favorite episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., Tracks, which happens to take place in the Italian countryside,
Su un treno che attraversa la campagna italiana.
which has been dubbed into Italian for Italian-speaking
Ci hanno
audiences.
informati le autorità italiane che controllano la situazione.
As you know, I strongly advocate using dubbed programming to advance your knowledge of the language. However, the biggest problem with that normally is that the subtitles in Italian, in this case, won't match at all. There'll be a translation of the original English. Here, however, we have the subtitles of the actual dubbed Italian and the English translation directly from that. So we're getting a perfect one-to-one ratio as much as possible so we can really learn vocabulary and grammar.
Ma ti rende la vita interessante.
Prego.
LingoPi is the only place I've seen that possible. You can turn either the English or the Italian subtitles on or off, or have both of them on. And anytime there's a new word that I want to learn, I just have to hover my mouse right over the text, the video pauses automatically, and I'm able to save it to my vocabulary list. I can review that vocabulary list anytime I want, even during the show, so that as it goes forward, I can remember a word that I was just learning. And even take a quiz to really master this new vocabulary that I thought was important. As you can see, LingoPi is integrated with Disney Plus as well as Netflix, along with a whole bunch of other content there on the website, with programming available in Spanish, French, Italian, German, Portuguese, Korean, Chinese, Russian, Turkish, and Dutch. It's amazing. So sign up at the link in the description and let LingoPi make movies and TV perfectly comprehensible. And that is the secret. You simply have to have something that is comprehensible. Yes, you can start with basic things and build slowly, but you can also go to more advanced things as long as you have some way to make it comprehensible, as I've talked about in various videos. So what does it mean to have something that is comprehensible input to further one's language acquisition? Not just learning about language, but language acquisition, this term that Stephen Krashen used very famously in his treatises and papers starting from the early 1980s. Comprehensible input, according to Krashen, is something called I+1. Lovely little formula. Well, what does that mean? It means that you are able to understand everything that is the I, and then you get a +1, something that's a little bit additional. For example, it depends. It's different for every person. For example, when I took the glass or cup of water, the bicchiere d'acqua, you probably understood. Okay, he's told. It's obvious what he's doing. The context makes it clear. He's describing this glass of water. He said aqua. I'm an English speaker. I know that aquatic is associated with water, so aqua probably means water. But maybe bicchiere was a totally new word to you. But I said, this is a bicchiere d'acqua. And I said, nel bicchiere c'è acqua. So you were able to understand N+1, the new term, which was bicchiere. Or if you heard libro at first, maybe you didn't quite follow it, but I said a libro a couple of times. But then you think, oh yeah, library, maybe that's associated with books, right? Libro, it's a libro. And then I talk about the book being, is it a libro italiano? And then I said, no, it's not a libro italiano, a libro giapponese. No, it's not a Japanese book, not an Italian book. It's a libro greco. So maybe you've never even heard the words in Italian of Giapponese or Italiano, but you can infer that Giapponese looks and sounds a lot like the word Japanese. Italiano sounds like the word Italian, and Greco sounds a lot like the English word Greek. This is audience dependent. If your native language is English, a lot of the things that I was thinking about in my head of trying to make this comprehensible for you, my audience, assuming you don't already know Italian, that was going through my head. Whereas if you don't have any words, any cognates of words like the ones I use today, it wouldn't necessarily be that comprehensible. So Krashen's comprehensible input theory is grounded on the hypothesis that one can only acquire language if communicated messages are understood. That is, a message must be communicated somehow from a book, from a person, from a TV show to the person learning the language, and the message must be understood. It doesn't have to be perfectly understood, but some amount has to be understood in order to get anywhere to start with, which kind of makes sense. It sounds a little bit obvious, but it's so useful when we then apply that pedagogically. And then we have this concept of N+1, where we have some amount that we understand, and we can go a little bit further and understand a few more things from context. Now, this is nice and simple, and it makes sense. And one of the ways that we can then apply it is then to see, okay, if we were to overwhelm the student with a lot of new vocabulary, if I were to, instead of just talking about some aqua and, the cafe, which is probably, that wasn't necessarily N+1, maybe it was N+2. But if you start doing N+40, you start overwhelming the student with a rash of new vocabulary. There are a lot of books out there that do that you probably know the ones I'm talking about. And it just makes it too difficult to really acquire the new vocabulary. But then what can we do? We still might need to use that book or use that tool to learn the language somehow. I'm thinking of a lot of these readers for, say, Latin and Ancient Greek, which have way too much vocabulary sometimes as you're trying to just follow what the heck is going on, because you really want to read the story, right? Especially if it's an actual piece of ancient history or a poem or something. And one way to do that, of course, is repetition. You isolate one thing, you can turn that into a personal flashcard, or you can write it down or associate it with something else. The point, though, is through reading something again and again, or watching something again and again, eventually that vocabulary will stick better and better. That's the way to turn an unideal piece of input into something that gets closer to that more comprehensible input. So it takes work. It can take work to take advantage of some of the amazing things out there, like I talked about in the scriptorium video or using the translations video. There are ways to take things that are difficult, not really comprehensible, and slowly, bit by bit, make them comprehensible. And really, this can work with grammar translation methods as well. If you're exposed, let's say, to a reader to learn a language, modern or ancient, at some point, the book is pedagogically expecting you to pick up on verb conjugations. You might need to understand, say, in ancient Greek, that lego means I say, leges means you say, lege means he, she says. And that from those endings alone, you're supposed to figure out which grammatical person is involved. What I think is pedagogically ideal for most people is to get exposed to some of those uses, to understand what's going on in the context of the story, but maybe you don't have a good mastery of those endings yet. Then find the verb chart, find the grammatical paradigm, memorize the endings, learn them with a few other verbs, not just lego, but luo, whatever we can think of, these different verbs, and eventually you associate, okay, that all ending, that's the ego form. I recognize that from context. And then you start to build internal verb paradigms. You get to build an internal reference grammar that helps you then make comprehensible further usages. So in my opinion, comprehensible input is not allergic to grammar. No, I mean, you're learning grammar. You need to acquire grammar. Grammar in reality is much more complex than just simple paradigms, but those things absolutely can then make comprehensible the messages you're trying to receive, whether through the written word, the spoken word, and thus be able to acquire an internal sense of the vocabulary, the grammar, all these things all at once, the pronunciation, and learning about the language, and really acquire it. And what's the difference between acquisition and learning? According to Krashen, learning is, learning facts about the language, how the paradigms work, how the grammar might work, how the vocabulary interacts with grammatical gender or something like that, how to form plurals. That's learning about the language. It's not irrelevant. However, acquisition isn't fundamentally separate from that, but it's something different. It means just as I have acquired English natively, or Italian, or Latin, or ancient Greek, these other languages, I've acquired them through exposure to messages that I fundamentally understood. And this approach of CI is really useful for the two reasons. One, that theoretically, it makes a lot of sense, and practically, it works kind of similar to the theoretical. You have a certain amount of information you already know, plus a new thing. And that way you can slowly build a sense of grammar and vocabulary, pronunciation, all these things, little by little. But the other is that it really helps to reduce something else that Krashen talks about, the affective filter. This is the filter of affect or emotion. That is, your stress levels are reduced and you're able to understand more because you're not stressed trying to remember too many things all at once. And since comprehensible input, especially in the beginning, is like tutto è stato poterion, questo il bicchiere, you get these little things little by little. With this extra context, you get the chance to form not only a non-adversarial relationship with the language and the language learning experience, but it becomes something warm and pleasant, enjoyable, something you look forward to doing, something you can't wait to do after you complete other obligations. And that may be one of the most important things, that motivation. I think we really take that for granted. In order to really acquire a language, you have to be motivated to do it because it takes a long time and it takes a lot of work. So if you want to acquire a new language, you saw some strategies today. Overall, a lot of the strategies, though, especially if you're a teacher, what you can do is you can create this context. At the beginning of the video, if I simply were to have said nel bicchiere c'è acqua without a visual context, you might not have known, but nel bicchiere c'è acqua. Acqua. That is how you make a message comprehensible, through that external buttressing, that scaffolding which permits the acquisition to occur. And then, once one has heard the vocabulary word bicchiere enough times, or acqua, then you can hear acqua in a completely different context, and you'll remember it. Nel bicchiere c'è acqua. So at least that one phrase, you probably know that now. That goes into at least short-term memory, and then with further exposure and repetition into long-term memory. So that's how comprehensible input works. I want to thank LingoPi again for sponsoring the video. Check them out, the link in the description. Thanks to every one of my Patreon supporters. There I put lots of input, which I try to make comprehensible in different ways. And thanks to each and every one of you for watching the video. Grazie a tutti e ci vediamo. Ciao!